one of the most confusing areas during a spiritual awakening is understanding this concept of oneness and unity from a more integrated and holistic perception. So today I'm going to be explaining exactly how to integrate oneness so that we're not confused by it or accidentally in separation consciousness from oneness. In my video, These Are the Signs That Your Third Eye is Opening, I talk about the different flavors and the different dimensions of oneness. You would think that oneness is one-dimensional, and yet it is the most multidimensional concept that there could possibly be. So oneness has within it, it is contained within it, this concept of differentiation. And one of the most confusing, if not challenging, things that a person goes through during a spiritual awakening is how to integrate this concept of there being differentiation inside oneness, and that is not the same as separation. So we think that naturally differentiation would imply separation consciousness. But that is not true, because oneness does not mean everything's exactly the same. Oneness is simply the deepest truth of our reality, which is at our very core. We all belong to the same heart. We are all different apertures of the one universal heart. This is what heart-centered consciousness reveals to us. It is that we are all one, and that oneness is what we know as unity consciousness, or that unified field of consciousness. But the unified field of consciousness is not against there being differentiation, and it's certainly not against there being a hierarchy of consciousness. So sometimes in the spiritual community, what gets very confusing is how we determine an egoic mindset. And in this egoic mindset, we might view everything as coming from a separate form of consciousness, therefore separation consciousness, versus there being a higher level of perception, one that is coming from the higher self or from the universal perception, which is oneness. So we have this duality at play between the ego being separate and therefore in a divided state, and the higher self being one that is already in the universal oneness and the universal unified field of consciousness. But even oneness has within it the ego. So the ego doesn't necessarily imply that you are in separation consciousness, that you are in a lower state of consciousness for understanding and for being able to discern that there is a hierarchy of evolution, and that there's nothing wrong with there being beings that are more advanced and beings that are less advanced. That does not imply separation consciousness. That does not imply you're creating division. What that implies is that we have discernment, and discernment is way different than judgment. We could look at discernment and judgment as being the same energy, but one is mature and the other one is immature. It is not ripe yet. Judgment is the immature expression of discernment. It is not discernment. It is not fully developed yet. So it falls upon its prejudice, its preconceived notions, its fear, its need for superiority, and its lack of information. So it's ignorance. You need all of those conjured within a soup together to create judgment. And that is not a developed or mature state of being, even though sometimes it tries to avail itself as being discernment. And then we have discernment, which is the mature expression of this energy of being able to perceive and to differentiate and to distinguish truth, because that's what discernment does. Discernment is our best ability to align with truth. And so, discernment is not coming from prejudice. It is not coming from preconceived notions or its own programming. And it's not coming from fear. It's coming from absorbing, to the best of its ability, truth, and then learning how to differentiate. So we actually need discernment to truly be inside unity consciousness or oneness, so that when we're in oneness, we're not blinded by the light of oneness. We're not blinded by unity to the extent that we won't be able to navigate our way through oneness, because we won't be able to perceive and acknowledge truth. And if we cannot perceive truth, then there's no way for us to become sovereign. So we will always be in a state of confusion, and will always stay inside some form of oneness or unity that is in the shadow side of oneness. Oneness has a shadow side. And because of that, what that looks like when we're navigating through a spiritual awakening comes in many forms, but one of them is us thinking that there's no such thing as differentiation, and that any type of teachings or any type of knowledge that talks about there being differentiation is naturally either dangerous or promoting separation consciousness. And that's not so simple. It takes more nuance to be able to understand oneness and to be able to understand our relationship with others inside oneness. The unified field of consciousness still contains within it different phases of growth and different levels of being. But sometimes we can have resistance to placing things in categories because we think that it pulls us out of oneness. But it only pulls us out of unity consciousness if we are using categories to justify abuse or segregation to other beings. This confusion is common to come across, even when understanding the different cycles of spiritual awakening, like in my videos, the first wave of ascension and the second wave of ascension. If we do not allow ourselves to perceive stages of maturation, we will reject the rites and passages that are unique to each distinct phase of growth. We will also end up rejecting the necessary themes we experience in each wave or cycle. We can fear falling into division or falling into judgment simply by acknowledging the distinct qualities within oneness. And for a good reason. It's because we don't want to repeat the past. The human experience does not have a great track record when it comes to placing people and things in categories. This is what I call a beautiful problem, because so many people going through a spiritual awakening are actually very responsible, so responsible that they don't want to fall into judgment, so they don't really build discernment. Or they're trying their best to train themselves out of the perception of judgment, but they're not aware that a lot of the times they're actually in discernment. So there's this confusion going on between judgment and discernment. And one of the things that many people going through a spiritual awakening are more inclined to do is to reject any form of uniqueness or any form of differentness, because they fear that that is going to be an egoic concept that feeds the ego and feeds separation consciousness. That is only correct half of the time. This is why we need discernment. We need discernment to see if a teaching is truly leading us into separation consciousness and more division, or if a teaching is actually based in unity consciousness. Even spiritualists that lived in every time period and in every age are reincarnating into experiences for them to balance their soul's past judgments and expand their own consciousness. It's an ever-evolving process that brings everyone into balance to help us release our judgments, because judgment release is the gateway to unity consciousness. So many beings who are awakening fall into this category of there being a lack of discernment because of fear of judgment. They don't want to fall into fear, and they don't want to have separation consciousness perpetuated more and more within the world. Which is beautiful. It's a beautiful problem. And then we have the opposite of that. We have people who are so much in judgment but they think they're in discernment, and they're not. They're in so much judgment as they're awakening. And when they're in so much judgment, what they're doing is first attracting those judgments to them within their reality so that they can be fully healed and fully balanced. But they don't know that. They don't know that they're attracting what they judge. So we just keep judging it even more because we think that'll help us stop attracting that judgment. When in reality, this is a massive balancing that's going on. It's a massive healing. And why we attract what we judge is so that ultimately we will no longer continue to judge it. And then we can really start getting into higher levels of consciousness rather than just praising the deities who had attained that state. We can start being that state. We can start living by it, and that would be true sovereignty. In fact, one of the most dominant indicators that you are truly in unity consciousness and you are truly enlightened is when you don't have an opinion about everything going on inside the world, but that you have very strong heart awakened and heart center opinions about the things that matter the most and the things that need to shift the most within this world. But as far as judgments go, you'll notice all of the pettiness of having so many different multitudes of opinions about every single thing drop off. And that's why higher states of consciousness are in so much peace. It's not because they're not provoked, they're not reactive to the suffering in the world. It's because they're mature enough to know what's worth putting their attention and care and action behind, and what is absolutely judgmental, narcissistic nonsense. So if we can't discern what is truly worth our attention and care and action to be put behind, versus just being in complete judgment of everything around us, then we're going to suffer and we're going to think that we're in higher unity states of consciousness, and we're really not. We're just feeling very special and very egotistical inside our judgments. And so this is why it's so important to be able to navigate the paradox of oneness. It's to know what is truly worth our time versus what is genuinely just a judgment because somebody is living their life differently than us, somebody is existing differently, somebody is being a different expression than we are. I truly have no opinion if somebody's twerking their butt on social media for a bunch of likes and attention, because we don't know what kind of healing is taking place. And many of us are doing the best we can to heal, and it may be in very distorted ways, but it's still a healing taking place, and it's not for us to judge. But when we're in discernment, what we're looking for is it consensual? Because if it is not consensual, that is when we need to place our attention, our care, and our action behind it. So when we're looking for, is this consensual? What that means is there force going on? Is there coercion taking place? Because anytime there is coercion, force, or some form of manipulation, then that is when things are not consensual. They needed to be manipulated or forced into a scenario. And so that's why one of the main mantras of an awakening being is, I do not consent. In fact, inside my video, how our consciousness is used to create reality, I talk about I do not consent and how powerful that is for a sovereign being to say, because there's so much dark magic that's being placed on us that is trying to manipulate us into consent. So the challenge of oneness and the challenge of discernment is to be able to recognize when we are falling into judgment and we're just judging everything around us that is not of us, that is a different expression. And we think that that is somehow, because it's a different expression, something that is bad or something that is wrong. Versus when we're genuinely in discernment. And that's when we're able to tell, is this consensual? Is there force taking place? Is there coercion taking place? And so that's why we can't just say, blatant platitudes like everything is equal or everything is one and everything is unity, so let's just not judge. Because discernment is so important to be able to navigate that truth of oneness. BTW, children cannot consent to anything. Nothing. Unless they're being abused in some form and then need to go seek emancipation, children are not able to consent. And to try to give a child or children the power of an adult is actually a satanic thought form, which I will explain later. Part of awakening is being able to clearly see the abuse of power that our institutions and that the military-industrial complex has placed over the human collective. But because there's been so much abuse of power, we may have an aversion to there being any form of there being individuals who are more advanced or individuals who are further along their spiritual journey than we are. But that would also be a state of egoicness if we can't even admit that there is wisdom, there is knowledge from others, and that we are learning from them. And so there's this balancing act that needs to happen within the self so that we can truly develop discernment in unity. And we're able to see that there is such a thing as there being more evolved beings, and there is such a thing as there being less evolved beings within this reality. So the conscious collective and the spiritual community are learning this right now. We're learning how to be our own inner authority and to notice the abuse of power and abuse of authority that's taken place within the world, while also learning how to be in relationship with others so that there can be such a thing as us learning from others without having our own power taken, or having us be able to teach others without taking another person's power. And we all have this place within a higher hierarchy that we're learning how to incorporate ourselves into, but it's all included within unity consciousness. Unity consciousness is not against this concept. We could even look at it, if we want to, from a different perception altogether, and it being a circle. And we can look at it as if all of our hands are in a circle, and what we receive from this hand, we take in and we give to this hand. So even a hierarchy can be perceived as just a circle navigating through discernment, and judgment is going to be the number one challenge when we're entering into unity consciousness. You will be faced with this time and time again. You will be faced with, am I in judgment or is this my discernment? With discernment, there is still going to be an emotional charge, because even though discernment has a mature perception and an integrated and holistic perception of what's happening, that still doesn't mean that you will be non-reactive. In fact, when you're coming from an awakened heart center, that doesn't make you emotionless. That just means now that there's deeper wisdom behind your emotions and they're communicating important information to you. Versus when we're in judgment. And when we're in judgment, we might feel that the background music to all of our beliefs is some form of fear. And so when we're in judgment, we need to stop other people's existence or other people's expression because it somehow threatens our own. And so this task, when it comes to embodying unity consciousness, is also being able to embody paradox, because truth holds within truth many different versions of it and many different grades. And not all truths are equal. There are truths that are more truthful. And that is always our task, is to be able to align with the highest capacity, the most truth within whatever level of consciousness that we are occupying. A very common misconception about oneness is that the ego is opposed to oneness. And so the ego is some sort of threat or enemy to this state of unity consciousness. When in reality, the ego is simply just a unique aspect of oneness. So the ego isn't inherently at all opposed to oneness, because oneness is so vast. Oneness can include there being uniqueness of perception and there being different egos, because the ego is simply our unique way of perceiving reality and of being. So it's our unique expression. So when the ego is in such a state of separation, it becomes inflamed. And this inflammation is what causes it to desire to dominate. And that's when the ego is a genuine issue that is opposing unity consciousness. It's just the lower expression of ego, because the higher expression of ego is simply our own intrinsic, unique way of being and existing. The biggest block to unity consciousness right now is the fact that there is a desire in many different subgroups to now create belief systems where they are the superior form of being within the world. And that came from them being so excluded from their reality that now their new belief systems have it where they are the most evolved form of being within the world. And this isn't pointed in any one direction. This is a collective issue that's going on right now. We have so many different subgroups that are falling into their own sub-belief systems where they are the superior being or the superior form of consciousness because of massive trauma, where they were at one point judged so harshly by their environment that now they had to reject their environment just the way that their environment rejected them. So if there's one thing going on right now that is a block to unity consciousness and oneness, it's not discernment, and it's definitely not differentiation. It's what we make that differentiation mean, what we assign it. Because if we assign it something in a judgmental way, that is when we're going to start seeing unity consciousness turn into its shadow form. I hope this has twerked your way into unity consciousness. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for higher dimensional guidance through spiritual awakening. See you next time.